They say justice is blind, but in the glittering corridors of the high-end hotel, it arrives with a sharp jawline and the roar of a light gray armored motorcade. On a humid Friday night, Noelle Parker lost everything because she chose to be a human being in a room filled with predators. She knelt on the cold marble to comfort a broken elderly woman, while the elite of the city stood in their designer silks, filming the humiliation for their Instagram followers. They didn't know that the woman on the floor was the only person on earth who could make a monster pray. They laughed at the waitress as she ruined her uniform to offer a hand. 10 minutes later, the laughter died in their throats. This is the story of how a single moment of compassion caused the Moretti Consortium to bring the city to a standstill. The charity fundraiser was the kind of event where the air smelled of imported lilies and arrogance. It was a world of excess that Noelle found sickening, given that a single bottle of the champagne she served could have funded her sister Harper's dialysis for a month. Noelle's feet, encased in cheap flats, throbbed as she navigated the room like a ghost, a rule strictly enforced by the manager, Clifford Bainbridge, who insisted she was merely furniture that refilled glasses and disappeared. At the center of the gala, the hostess Annalise Rowan held court, her influencer smile as sharp and cold as the ice sculptures beside her. When the heavy doors opened and an elderly woman in a vintage wool coat wandered in looking disoriented, the room didn't go silent. It began to whisper with mockery. As the woman passed Annalise's circle, the hostess extended a slender leg, a quick, cruel movement that sent the woman's cane sliding across the polished floor. The old woman collapsed with a brittle gasp, her purse spilling a rosary and a faded photograph across the marble. The room erupted in high-pitched laughter. No one moved to help, until Noelle Parker dropped her tray and let 30 crystal flutes shatter like a gunshot. Ignoring the screams of "clumsy rat" from the manager, Noelle dropped to her knees in the puddle of glass to shield the woman. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. The main entrance was kicked open with a violence that shook the chandeliers. Dante Moretti, the tall, muscular head of the Moretti Consortium, stepped in, his light gray suit sharp and his intense features a mask of fury. He froze mid-stride, his eyes widening in visible shock as he stared at the fallen woman. The most feared man in the city fell to his knees, ignoring the champagne soaking his trousers, and whispered a single word that turned the elite's blood to ice: "Mama." The air in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis was thick with the scent of vanilla orchids and the stifling weight of old money. For Noelle Parker, the atmosphere felt more like a chokehold. She adjusted the collar of her stiff polyester uniform, which was 2 sizes too big and scratched relentlessly at her neck. She had been a ghost in these halls for 6 months, picking up every double shift the prestige catering company offered. To the guests in their diamond-dusted gowns, she didn't exist. To her, they were merely obstacles between her and the paycheck that kept her younger sister, Harper, alive. Every step Noelle took in her cheap Walmart flats felt like walking on broken glass. Her feet were throbbing, a dull, rhythmic ache that timed itself to the pounding of her heart. She had to stay focused. Harper's dialysis treatments weren't just expensive, they were the thin thread holding her sister to this world. If Noelle faltered, if she missed a single shift, that thread would snap. "You are furniture," the floor manager, Clifford Bainbridge, had hissed earlier that evening. "You are a ghost. You do not exist unless a glass is empty." Noelle lived by those rules. She moved through the sea of velvet tuxedos with practiced invisibility, her mind far away in a cramped apartment in Queens where the smell of antiseptic replaced the fragrance of lilies. She watched Annalise Rowan, a woman whose smile was as polished and hollow as a porcelain doll, holding court near a towering ice sculpture. Annalise's world was one of Tom Ford suits and viral moments. Noelle's world was one of medical bills and counting pennies. As Annalise snapped her fingers for more wine without even glancing at the person serving it, Noelle whispered a soft, "Of course, ma'am," while her legs trembled with a fatigue that went deeper than her bones. She was a shadow serving the sun, a girl wearing a scratchy uniform that felt like a shroud, yet she held her chin up. She was the only person in the room who truly knew the value of a life, even if she had to become a ghost to protect one. The heavy double doors of the ballroom creaked open, admitting a figure that looked like a fragment of a different era. Luciana Moretti stepped onto the polished marble, her late 70s showing in the way she leaned into a simple wooden cane. She wasn't draped in the trendy, revealing cuts favored by the young influencers surrounding the ice sculpture. Instead, she wore a heavy black vintage coat and a silk scarf wrapped carefully around her head. To the sea of velvet and diamonds, she looked like a grandmother who had taken a wrong turn on her way to a neighborhood church. The room didn't fall silent. Instead, it rippled with the cruel static of confusion and whispered jests. Elite guests peered over their crystal flutes, mocking her orthopedic shoes and questioning how security had allowed a cleaning lady through the front entrance. Luciana seemed disoriented, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the wealthy as if searching for someone familiar. As she shuffled past Annalise Rowan's inner circle, the hostess didn't offer a hand. She extended a slender, manicured leg in a subtle, lightning-fast movement. The wooden cane hit the silk of Annalise's dress and lost all traction on the slick marble. It happened in a sickening slow motion. Luciana let out a dry, brittle gasp as she crumbled, landing hard on her hip while her purse spilled its meager contents, a rosary, a few hard candies, and a faded photograph, across the gleaming floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence, followed by Annalise's high-pitched melodic laugh. "Oops," she chirped, covering her mouth while pulling out her phone to record. "Clean up on aisle 5. I think the homeless shelter is down the block, sweetie." The laughter was contagious, spreading through the circle as men chuckled into their scotch and women smirked behind their clutches. Not a single hand reached out to help the woman struggling to push herself up, her face contorted in pain and humiliation. Noelle Parker watched from the periphery, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't calculate the cost of her rent or the looming medical bills for Harper. She simply saw a human being in agony. Breaking the first rule of the invisible, Noelle dropped her serving tray. The crash of 30 crystal flutes shattered the atmosphere like a gunshot, spraying champagne onto the hems of the nearby designer gowns. Ignoring Clifford Bainbridge's screamed threats of termination, Noelle dropped to her knees in the puddle of glass and alcohol. She didn't care that the shards cut into her cheap stockings. She wrapped her catering jacket around the old woman's trembling shoulders, her voice soft but burning with a quiet rage. "I've got you," she whispered, shielding Luciana's body from the flashing phone cameras. "Don't try to move too fast. I'm not letting them hurt you anymore." The air in the ballroom didn't just grow cold, it turned lethal. The heavy double doors at the main entrance were kicked open with a violence that vibrated through the floorboards, silencing the cruel laughter mid-breath. 6 men in suits that cost more than luxury cars marched in with military precision, their hands hovering near their waistbands in a silent promise of destruction. They were the Iron Bastion, predators who moved as a single, terrifying unit to form a perimeter around the room. But it was the 7th man who sucked the oxygen from the air. Dante Moretti stepped forward, his tall, muscular frame silhouetted against the hall lights, his light gray suit a sharp contrast to the darkness radiating from his expression. He walked with a commanding presence that caused the crowd to part like the Red Sea, faces draining of color as the name Moretti rippled through the room in terrified whispers. Dante reached the center of the marble floor and suddenly froze mid-stride. His eyes, usually masks of cold calculation, widened in visible shock. His jaw tightened, and his breath hitched as he stared at the woman on the floor, the vagrant they had all mocked. The most feared man in the city fell to his knees, ignoring the expensive fabric of his trousers soaking up the spilled champagne and the shards of glass that bit into his skin. "Mama," he whispered, his voice a low, trembling rumble that carried the weight of 1,000 storms. He reached out, his large hands shaking as he touched Luciana's face, his fury momentarily eclipsed by raw, agonizing concern. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of impending doom. Dante's head turned slowly, his neck muscles corded with tension as his obsidian gaze scanned the frozen faces of the elite. When Luciana patted Noelle's hand and rasped that the waitress had helped her while the others laughed, the mask of the Reaper returned to Dante's face. He stood up, towering over the cowering crowd, and the vulnerability was gone, replaced by a violence so raw it felt like a physical blow. "Lock the doors," he commanded, his voice eerily calm. The heavy thud of the locks engaging echoed like a gavel through the ballroom. Dante's eyes landed on Annalise Rowan and Clifford Bainbridge, who were trembling so hard their knees knocked together. "Nobody leaves," Dante stated, his gaze narrowing on the woman who had extended her leg to trip his mother. "Not until I find out who thought my mother's dignity was a joke." The gala was no longer a celebration of wealth. It had become a cage, and the reaper was ready to collect his due. Dante Moretti stood in the center of the silent ballroom, a monolith of charcoal-gray silk and barely contained violence. He turned his gaze from the trembling staff to Noelle, who remained kneeling on the floor, her hands still steadying Luciana's shoulders. The menacing aura that had paralyzed the room vanished as he looked at the waitress, replaced by an intense, dark curiosity. He reached down, his large, scarred hand extending toward her with absolute authority. "Stand up, Noelle Parker," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that felt like a physical weight. Noelle took his hand, feeling the calloused strength as he pulled her up effortlessly. He stepped closer, his scent of expensive cologne and tobacco filling her senses, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of greed that he was used to seeing in everyone else. At his signal, a member of the Iron Bastion stepped forward, clicking open a heavy briefcase to reveal stacks of $100 bills, at least $50,000 in cold, hard cash. "For your trouble," Dante said, his voice level. "For the job you lost and the sister you care for. Take it and go home in my car." The room held its breath. Clifford Bainbridge and Annalise Rowan watched with envy, expecting the clumsy waitress to snatch the life-changing sum. Instead, Noelle looked at the money, then lifted her chin, meeting Dante's obsidian gaze with green eyes that were wide and honest. She stepped back, her hands clasped firmly behind her back. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing through the silent hall. Dante's brows knitted together in a rare display of surprise. He had bought judges and broken CEOs, but he had never met a ghost who refused his gold. "No? You need this for your sister's medicine, do you not?" "I helped your mother because she was a human being in pain," Noelle replied, her voice trembling slightly with the adrenaline of the night. "If I take that money, it turns my compassion into a transaction. It cheapens the only thing I have left, my integrity." A soft, knowing laugh came from Luciana, who was now seated in a velvet chair nearby. "She is proud, Dante," the matriarch whispered. "She is rare." Dante slowly lowered the briefcase, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips for the first time. The air between them crackled with a new kind of tension, not of fear, but of profound respect. "Loyalty is the only currency I value, and you have proven yours is not for sale," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You won't be working for these monsters anymore. You will come with us. My mother needs a guardian she can trust, and you need a position that reflects your worth." The Moretti estate was not merely a house. It was a limestone fortress disguised as a palace, hidden deep within the most secluded reaches of the Hamptons. As the armored Bentley rolled through the towering iron gates, Noelle gripped her sister Harper's hand, feeling the younger girl's pulse racing in sync with her own. Harper looked out the tinted window with wide, fearful eyes at the manicured lawns that stretched for miles, patrolled by armed guards from the Iron Bastion and restless German shepherds. "Is this real, Noelle?" Harper whispered, clutching her portable medical equipment. "Are we being kidnapped?" Noelle forced a steady breath, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. "We're being hired, Harper," she replied, hoping the lie sounded like the truth. "Just remember, we stick together." The car came to a halt before a massive limestone mansion that rivaled the scale of the White House. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the grand entrance, was Dante Moretti. He had traded his light gray suit for a black button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate dark ink of tattoos that wrapped around his forearms like thorns. He didn't look at Noelle as they stepped out. His obsidian gaze was fixed on Harper. "My mother has prepared the East Wing for you," Dante said, his voice surprisingly soft as he addressed the intimidated girl. "It is equipped with hospital-grade filtration and a dedicated generator for your equipment. The best specialist in the state will be here by 4 to review your case." Noelle stood stunned, realizing he had orchestrated a small miracle in a matter of hours. But as she began to thank him, the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp intensity. "Don't thank me yet," Dante warned, stepping closer until the air between them crackled with tension. "This isn't a vacation. My mother is stubborn, and your job is to keep her alive. If she falls again, you answer to me." He turned his gaze toward the shadows of the surrounding woods, where the glint of a sniper's scope caught the light. "And remember, Noelle, the world now knows you are under my protection. That means you have a target on your back." As the massive oak doors closed behind them with the heavy thud of a vault, Noelle realized they hadn't just found a sanctuary. They had entered a shadow war where loyalty was the only shield they had left. The house was a vast, shadowed labyrinth after midnight, a silent monument to the power and paranoia of the Moretti consortium. Noelle found herself in the industrial-sized kitchen, unable to sleep as the weight of her new reality pressed against her chest. She moved toward the refrigerator for milk, her footsteps echoing softly on the tiles, until she turned the corner and froze. Dante was there, sitting at the central island with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He was shirtless, his back turned to her, and the sight stopped the breath in Noelle's throat. His skin was not the smooth, untouchable surface suggested by his tailored suits. It was a roadmap of agony. Jagged knife slashes, the puckered craters of bullet wounds, and long, silver burn scars crisscrossed his broad shoulders. It was a history of a life lived in a state of permanent war. Noelle hesitated, then walked slowly into the light of the overhead pendant. As he swiveled on the stool, she saw a fresh, ugly purple bruise blooming across his ribs. "Rough day at the office?" she asked, her voice dry despite the pounding in her ears. Dante huffed a sound that might have been a laugh. "Negotiations broke down," he replied, his eyes dark and soul-weary. Noelle didn't ask if the other person was alive. The answer was written in the cold intensity of his gaze. Instead, she moved toward the first aid cabinet she had already organized for Luciana. "Sit still," she commanded softly, returning with antiseptic and bandages. Dante watched her, his muscles rock-hard as she stepped between his spread knees. As she dabbed a small cut on his bicep, he didn't flinch, but the heat radiating from his skin felt like standing next to a furnace. "Why did you really take us in?" she whispered, her fingers lingering near the fresh bruise. "You don't strike me as a charitable man." Dante leaned in, his face inches from hers, the scent of whiskey and danger clouding her senses. "I'm not charitable. I'm possessive," he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "In my world, loyalty is the rarest currency. You showed it to a stranger who had nothing. That makes you a rare thing, and I collect rare things." Noelle's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Is that all I am? A collectible?" Dante's gaze dropped to her lips, a flash of raw hunger breaking through his mask. "No. You're a liability," he muttered, his hand hovering near her waist before he abruptly stood and backed away. "Because looking at you makes me want to burn the world down just to keep you warm, and I can't afford that distraction." He grabbed the bottle and vanished into the shadows, leaving Noelle standing in the silence, trembling from a heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen air. The truce between Noelle and Dante remained fragile as they avoided each other for days, but the outside world was not so kind. 2 weeks into her stay, Luciana insisted on attending the opening of a new Italian restaurant, Illinois Seo, a family-owned establishment where the matriarch felt she must make an appearance. Against Noelle's better judgment, she was swept into a deep emerald silk gown that left her back exposed, a dress that made Dante stop mid-stride when she descended the foyer stairs. For a second, his guard dropped and pure raw hunger flashed across his face before he growled for her to put on a coat, claiming she was drawing too much attention. Il Seo was a spectacle of glass and candlelight, filled with the elite of the underworld mingling with compromised politicians. Dante guided them to a VIP booth positioned to monitor every entrance, sitting Noelle so close she could feel his body heat as a constant, warning presence. "Don't talk to anyone," he murmured in her ear. "You are never safe when you are with me." The evening shattered with the arrival of Rafael De Luca, the rival leader with too much hair gel and a braying, arrogant laugh. He walked over to their table, ignoring the glares of the Iron Bastion, and boomed a greeting to Luciana before his eyes drifted to Noelle. "And who is this fresh meat, Dante?" Raphael sneered, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made Noelle's skin crawl. "I didn't know you had a new mistress. Usually, you go for the plastic ones. This one looks homegrown." Dante's hand clenched around his steak knife until his knuckles turned white, his voice dropping to a deadly calm as he told Raphael to walk away. But Raphael only laughed, reaching out a hand to touch Noelle's bare shoulder. Before his fingers could graze her skin, Noelle moved. She didn't shrink away. She stood up slowly, her green eyes blazing with the honesty and defiance that had first caught Dante's attention. She picked up a glass of heavy red wine and met the rival boss's gaze. "He pays me for my loyalty," Noelle said clearly, "something you clearly can't buy, seeing as your own men are looking at you with disgust." Before Raphael could blink, she splashed the wine directly into his face. The red liquid dripped down his expensive white shirt as the restaurant went silent. Raphael roared, lunging for her, but Dante was already a blur of motion, catching the rival by the throat and slamming him onto the adjacent table as glass shattered. The war had officially begun. The aftermath of the wine-soaked confrontation was a blur of adrenaline and cold steel. Dante gripped Noelle's hand with a force that bordered on painful, dragging her toward the back exit of the restaurant as the Iron Bastion formed a defensive wall behind them. The cold night air of the alleyway hit Noelle's face like a slap, but before she could catch her breath, Dante had her pinned against the rough brickwork. "Are you insane?" he shouted, his pupils dilated with a mixture of terror and fury. "You threw wine at Rafael De Luca. He would have put a bullet in your brain without blinking. He insulted your mother. He insulted us." Noelle yelled back, her voice shaking with the same defiance that had ignited the room. "I felt safe because you were there. I knew you wouldn't let him touch me." The confession hung in the air, softening the hard lines of Dante's face. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. "You make me want to be a man I can't be, Noelle," he whispered, his hands cupping her face with a desperate, rough tenderness. When he crashed his lips onto hers, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of wine, fear, and a possession so deep it felt like a brand.
The moment was shattered by the screech of tires. A black SUV swerved into the alley, and the muzzles of submachine guns poked through the windows like the teeth of a mechanical beast. Dante's instincts, honed by a lifetime of violence, took over instantly. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He simply threw Noelle to the pavement, covering her body entirely with his own. The rapid-fire staccato of bullets chewed up the bricks above them, raining dust and debris onto their huddling forms. Noelle felt Dante grunt, his heavy frame jerking sharply against her as the impact of lead met flesh. As the SUV sped off into the darkness, a terrifying silence returned to the alley. "Dante," Noelle whispered, her voice cracking. She felt something warm and wet seeping through the emerald silk of her gown. Dante rolled off her, gasping for air, his white shirt rapidly turning a deep, visceral red. "I told you," he wheezed, his bloody hand reaching up to stain her cheek one last time before his eyes rolled back. "I'm dangerous to be around." Noelle screamed for help into the empty night, realized with a crushing, agonizing clarity that the monster she had grown to love had just sacrificed himself to keep her breathing. The hospital room felt like a tomb, the air heavy with the mechanical hiss of the ventilator breathing for the man who had always seemed invincible. For 3 days, Noelle had not left Dante's side, her emerald dress ruined and stained with the blood he had shed to shield her. As she sat in the dim glow of the monitors, watching the mighty head of the Moretti consortium reduced to a pale figure covered in tubes, a terrifying clarity took hold. She was in love with the monster who had saved her life, and now he was defenseless. Crying would not save him, only the truth would. Noelle reached for the plastic effects bag on the side table and pulled out Dante's phone. It was a sleek, black device that held the keys to an empire, but it was locked behind a passcode she didn't know. She tried his mother's birthday and the date of his father's death, but the screen remained cold and unresponsive. Then, she remembered the midnight in the kitchen and the intensity in his eyes when he spoke of her loyalty. With trembling fingers, she typed in the date of the charity gala, the night they had first met. The phone clicked open. Dante had used the moment he met her as the code to his entire world. Noelle's heart skipped as she navigated to a secure messaging app, her eyes scanning the logs from the night of the ambush. There, sent at 8:15 p.m. while they were still at the restaurant, was a message detailing their exact table location and the predetermined emergency exit route through the north alley. The recipient was an anonymous asset, but it was the sender that made Noelle's blood turn to ice. The information had been forwarded to Dante's phone as an FYI from Clifford Bainbridge. The hotel manager hadn't just been a cruel bully, he was the leak who had shared the Iron Bastion's security protocols with Rafael DeLuca. Noelle dropped the phone on the bed just as the door to the trauma bay opened. Clifford stepped inside, holding a bouquet of lilies and wearing a mask of practiced concern that Noelle now recognized as the skin of a snake. "He's stable," Noelle said, her voice tight as she casually placed her hand over the phone to hide it. She looked at the man who had once called her a ghost, realizing that while she had been invisible to the elite, she had seen everything, including the traitor standing right in front of her. The hospital room was a silent trap, the air thick with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator and the hidden scent of betrayal. Luciana Moretti stood in the shadows, her presence unyielding as she watched Noelle move with the cold precision of a woman who had found steel in her spine. They had fed the bait to the wolves, whispering that the Reaper was finally waking up. At 4:12 a.m. the door clicked open. Clifford Bainbridge slipped inside, no longer the arrogant manager of a hotel, but a predator seeking to finish what the alleyway ambush had started. He crossed the room with a syringe of poison, murmuring a final insult to the man who had supposedly chosen war for a mere waitress. "She's not just a waitress," Noelle said, stepping from the darkness with her phone raised, recording every word of his confession. Clifford spun, a thin, panicked smile flaring as he offered her money and then threatened her ruin. He took a step toward her, but before he could reach her, a hand burst from the hospital sheets. Dante's grip crushed Clifford's wrist with a strength that defied his wounds. His eyes were open, burning with a lethal clarity. "I was never asleep," he rasped, his voice a low promise of the end. "I was waiting." One muffled shot from the Iron Bastion standing in the hall ended the betrayal. As the traitor's body was cleared away, Dante slumped back, his blood beginning to soak through his bandages as Noelle caught him, holding him together with shaking hands. "I chose war for you," he whispered against her hair. "And I'll choose you every time," she answered, the invisible ghost finally claiming her place in the light. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis glittered once more, but the hierarchy had shifted forever. As Dante and Noelle descended the stairs, the room parted in a wave of silence and raw fear. Dante was scarred but standing tall, and Noelle was radiant in silk, unbowed and lethal. She stopped beside Annalise Rowan, who looked as though she might faint. "Careful with your drink," Noelle said softly, her voice echoing the authority of a sovereign. "The staff works very hard." As they danced, Noelle rested her head against Dante's chest, over the scar that marked the night her kindness became their power. The waitress was gone. The queen of the consortium had arrived, proving that while arrogance is expensive, loyalty pays back with interest.